Hi, everyone. This is the final PowerPoint that I'm recording for kind of an overview of the civil rights movement in the 1950s. And in this one, I want to say just a few things about the Montgomery bus boycott, some details. And I went over this with the class in the Zoom session, but some details I want to add in addition to what Eric Foner has to say about it. So most of you have been exposed to some coverage of the Montgomery bus boycott. It's taught much more widely than it used to be. And I mentioned in the narrated PowerPoints about the murder of Emmett Till, that Emmett's murder, there's a direct connection to that in the Montgomery bus boycott. And the Rosa Parks, a seamstress in Montgomery and an activist who had been very active and a leader within the local chapter of the NAACP, is riding a bus home from work in Montgomery one afternoon. Bus is crowded, completely full, and one white passenger gets on, and the bus driver orders 4 black passengers to stand up and surrender their seats so the one white passenger can sit down. 3 did. She refuses to get up. So again, this driver is clearing an entire row for one white person to sit. And her refusal to do so ends up in the driver pulling over, calling the police. She's arrested. And this is going to be the event that sets in motion the Montgomery bus boycott. So I showed this to the class, this picture. I love this, where you've got in the foreground Rosa Parks, and behind her this young 26-year-old minister who hadn't been in town that long, less than 2 years, Martin Luther King Jr., who was pastor at a prominent black church in Montgomery, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And quite unexpectedly, he is going to become the face of the Montgomery bus boycott and its spokesperson, and that in turn is going to catapult him to being a nationally recognized figure. But nobody knew this all was going to happen when the Montgomery bus boycott started. And I mentioned in class an important detail to know about this is that it was not King and the other black male ministers who planned the boycott, but it was a group of black professional women. And I tried to explain to the class that especially here in St. Louis area, where riding the bus has this kind of stigma that you don't see in other cities, that sometimes it can be difficult for students to understand how you could mobilize a community around the issue of riding the bus. And I explained that every aspect of riding the public bus in Montgomery, which majority of black residents did on a daily basis, but every aspect of it was humiliating and degrading. The buses were segregated, as you know. There wasn't a single black bus driver in Montgomery. They were all white, and they had dictatorial control where they could expand the whites-only seating if necessary, which is what happened the day that Rosa Parks was riding the bus. Abusive language, use of racial slurs by white bus drivers directed at black passengers of all ages was common. There had been sexual assaults of black women that the Montgomery police had not investigated, pursued, nobody prosecuted. Just the act of getting on the bus was degrading, as I explained to the class. When the bus pulled up, black passengers entered the front door, paid your fare, but you then had to turn around, exit the front door, walk to the rear door of the bus, and enter there. So you didn't walk through the whites-only section. And I mentioned how the driver that Rosa Parks had her encounter with was among a group of drivers who like to play this trick on black passengers when the opportunity presented itself, where they would pull the bus to a stop at the bus stop, black passenger would enter the front door, pay their fare, exit, driver would snap both doors shut and roar off, leaving them stranded. This driver in particular was a well-known ass, strongly disliked by black passengers. And so those are some of the things I want you to keep in mind when you're thinking about how you mobilize a community around this issue. The woman that you see here, I mentioned Joanne Robinson, was an English professor at Alabama State College, historically black college in Montgomery. She was from Cleveland, got this job, moved to Montgomery, and the Deep South was a culture shock to her. She had had an unpleasant, to say the least, encounter with a white driver a year earlier, where she had inadvertently sat in a whites only seat on a bus that wasn't that crowded and was looking out the window kind of daydreaming, and all of a sudden she heard a voice say, "Get your black ass out of that seat." And it was a driver looming over her with his hand drawn back as if he was going to hit her. And she was so upset by this that she related this incident to a group of women that she had become involved with, a professional, this is an organization of black professional women in Montgomery called the Women's Political Council. And Joanne Robinson had joined, and after this incident, she related this story to the other members, expecting them to be equally horrified and angry, and everyone was nodding their heads, and she quickly learned everybody had some similar story. And so these women started talking about, if we ever confronted this, how would you go about it? How would you draw attention to the issue? Say if you organize something like a boycott, which is an idea they came up with as a form of protest. Initially, they envisioned this as being a short-lived boycott of, initially when they talked about it, they thought maybe a day or two, and then later a week. They didn't envision it going on a year and a half as it did. But these are the women who devise all the plans, how you would do this, how you would let people know, how you would get the word out, how you would organize alternative transportation for people, how you would respond to harassment by the Montgomery Police Department, which they received. So they have this whole plan, and that's what's implemented once the boycott starts. But it's these black professional women who come up with this when the boycott is implemented in 1955, and it's going to last into 1956 until there's a court decision ruling this segregated seating on buses unconstitutional. And that's one example of the legacy of Emmett Till, the Montgomery bus boycott, but also I mentioned how you had this whole generation of black teenagers, around Emmett's age in the 50s, who become college students in the 60s, and they're the ones that launch the sit-ins and the efforts to integrate public facilities that we'll talk about when we get to the 1960s. So as I said at the end of the second part of the Emmett Till PowerPoint, his murder has a profound impact in the short term and the long term as well. The Montgomery bus boycott being an example of an event that was a response in part to Emmett's murder just a few months before.